At 37,000 feet above sea level in the quiet hum of first-class luxury, a slap echoed louder than the turbulence. But it wasn't the sound of a hand. It was the insult embedded in a tray of reheated congealed pasta thrown in front of a passenger who dared to exist where others assumed she didn't belong. You should be grateful we found anything at all. The flight attendant snapped her tone, venom laced with condescension. The cabin froze. First-class passengers tucked into plush leather seats and sipping vintage wines turned their heads, but not to help. They watched. Jasmine Wilson, seated in 2A, held a passport, a first-class ticket, and a calm that belied the fire stirring in her veins. They didn't know who she was, not yet. They didn't know she wasn't just a passenger. She was the reason this airline still had funding, the hidden force behind a recent acquisition, and the woman who had just been slapped figuratively and soon literally by an employee of her own company. Before we dive into this explosive story of disrespect, power, and public accountability, comment where you're watching from, and if you believe respect shouldn't depend on appearances, hit it subscribe. Now, the gate to Atlantic Airways Flight 247 gleamed under fluorescent lights. Premium passengers were already streaming through the velvet ropes waved past with cheerful smiles and nods. Jasmine Wilson stood at the threshold, platinum card in hand, boarding pass folded crisply, travel tote, slung over her shoulder with practiced grace. She was dressed like success, a tailored navy blue suit, subtle diamond studs, and Italian leather loafers. But to gate agent Ashley, it wasn't enough. Or worse, it was too much. "Ma'am, economy is boarding from gate 12. Ashley said sharply, her voice carrying a smug finality. Several nearby passengers turned. A few brows raised, a few smirks lingered. Jasmine held her composure like armor. "I'm flying first class," she replied evenly, extending her ticket and loyalty card. Ashley blinked as if she hadn't expected the words. Her hand moved with deliberate slowness, snatching the documents, flipping the boarding pass twice. Her eyes narrowed at the name. "Platinum Elite," she asked, a question laced with accusation rather than confirmation. "Yes. And how did you get that status?" Jasmine smiled, small, cold, knowing. "By flying more than most of your passengers, for over a decade." Ashley held the pause just long enough to insult. Then she jabbed the scanner. "Beep. Proceed." As Jasmine walked toward the jet bridge, she heard the whisper, "Probably using someone else's card." She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. But she did take mental note of the badge Ashley D. 10 feet later, her phone buzzed with a secure notification, acquisition complete. Jasmine Wilson was now the controlling owner of Atlantic Airways. She almost laughed. At the cabin door, flight attendant Brittany offered a practiced smile to a white man in front of her, then glanced at Jasmine and froze. "Economy's that way." Jasmine offered her boarding pass without a word. The smile vanished. The fake polish peeled away. Brittany read the seat 2A and visibly stiffened. She muttered something under her breath, stepped aside, and gestured vaguely down the aisle. Second row. As Jasmine moved into the pristine first-class cabin, heads turned. She saw it immediately: discomfort, confusion, entitlement, flickering across perfectly composed faces. Some looked up from champagne glasses, some from newspapers, and some didn't bother hiding their surprise. She reached seat 2A, set her bag in the overhead bin, and sank into the plush leather chair. The man across the aisle, silver hair, Hermes tie, Rolex exposed, barely concealed his stare. Jasmine ignored them all. She tapped open her tablet, already synced to her private network, already monitoring Atlantic Airways Q1 employee behavior audit. She didn't need to see the data to know what was happening. She was experiencing it. A cart rolled by. Champagne glasses clinked. "Champagne before takeoff," Sir Brittany asked with syrup in her voice to the man in 2B. He nodded, already reaching for the flute. Brittany turned. Her tray dropped slightly as she passed Jasmine without pause, without eye contact, without offering anything. Jasmine waited. Nothing. She raised her hand. "Excuse me," Brittany kept walking. 10 minutes passed. Every passenger in the cabin had received a drink. Every passenger except Jasmine. Across the aisle, the man who'd accepted champagne earlier looked confused. "Excuse me," he called out as Brittany passed again. She didn't get a drink. Brittany turned slowly, like gravity resisted her. "We're out of the premium selection," she said flatly. "She can have water after takeoff." The man furrowed his brow. "Really, you just offered me a second glass." "We're adjusting service levels based on flight constraints," she said coolly and vanished. Jasmine said nothing. She tapped her tablet, logged it pre-departure service, withheld selective. No explanation provided. Minutes later, a second flight attendant approached her with a small paper cup of tap water. No tray, no napkin, not even a word. She placed it on the armrest like it was a burden, then left. Jasmine didn't touch it. Instead, she leaned back, stared at the cabin ceiling, and reminded herself why she had acquired this airline. Not for profit, not for ego, but for moments exactly like this. Because she was tired of fighting invisible battles. Because somewhere a little black girl was watching. And because today, unlike the rest of her life, Jasmine held all the cards. As the jet engines roared to life and the plane pulled back from the gate, Jasmine Wilson remained still in seat 2A, her hands resting lightly on the polished armrest. The vibrations beneath her feet felt familiar, like the pulse of power idling quietly beneath restraint. Around her, the cabin hummed with the sound of seatbelt clicks, boarding chatter, and the rustle of newspapers. But within her mind, a different kind of engine had started. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a CEO. She was the architect of this entire operation. And tonight, the plan would unfold in real time. The captain's voice echoed overhead, confirming the route to New York and expected turbulence mid-flight. Jasmine barely heard it. She was staring ahead at the curtains separating the first-class cabin from the galley where she'd seen Brittany and the other attendants whispering, laughing, as if their behavior were a shared inside joke. A mistake they would never make again. Jasmine adjusted her seat back slightly and retrieved her phone. Unlike most commercial travelers, she didn't rely on the public Wi-Fi. Her phone was connected to a secure encrypted satellite channel, one designed for global executives, government officials, and intelligence operatives. With a simple swipe, she unlocked an interface that didn't exist on any app store. At the top, codename Aegis. Below that, secure Directive 4C, Atlantic Live Monitoring. She tapped a sequence of symbols. A secure line opened. Miles below, in a glass-paneled command center deep inside a New York skyscraper, Jasmine's chief operations officer, Malik Jennings, received the ping. He was already seated in front of 5 screens displaying personnel matrices, customer behavior models, and real-time analytics of Atlantic Airways operations. The moment he saw the identifier JW Live, Malik sat straighter. A brief message appeared: Jasmine Flight 247. Live incident. Multiple violations in progress. Begin silent audit. Prepare escalation. Malik didn't hesitate. Within 60 seconds, he initiated phase 1 of their internal review protocol. Every interaction involving the first-class cabin was flagged. Crew rosters were pulled. Internal behavior logs were cross-referenced with facial recognition cues from the onboard camera feed. Back in the air, Jasmine reached down, unzipped her tote bag, and slid out a leather portfolio. From within, she removed a single sheet, an internal document signed and timestamped 2 weeks earlier. It granted her executive oversight privileges of Atlantic Airways in-flight performance under a rarely used clause, systemic risk observation and response. Clause 17B, buried in the corporate acquisition agreement, allowed her to act without prior board approval if a live incident exposed systemic bias threatening brand liability. She folded the document carefully and slipped it into the seat pocket in front of her. Let them keep treating her like she didn't belong. They were building her case better than any lawyer ever could. A second cart rolled through the aisle. This time it wasn't champagne. It was meal service. The attendants moved like they were performing in a ballet. Polished trays whispered wine pairings, silverware laid with precision. Jasmine watched as each white male passenger received tailored attention. Filet mignon sliced tableside, a choice of Chilean sea bass or saffron risotto, wine offered with vineyard origin stories. She waited. Row by row, meal after meal, the performance unfolded. And still no one approached her. When Brittany finally appeared, sullen, hurried, she dropped a tray in front of Jasmine like an afterthought. No silverware, no presentation. A slab of overcooked chicken on a plastic tray paired with wilted lettuce and a broken dinner roll. No explanation, no apology, just the whispered venom. Be grateful you got anything. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't blink. Instead, she quietly reached into her tote and tapped a second button on her tablet. Miles away, Malik saw the signal and activated phase 2. That's when everything changed. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber. The hush of mid-flight set in. But behind the scenes, an entire infrastructure was coming to life. Within 30 minutes, Malik had already flagged 6 separate FAA policy violations, discriminatory service practices, denial of prepaid amenities, failure to comply with meal request confirmations, and most importantly, crew escalation without just cause. He opened a secure line to Captain Reynolds' private aviation inbox. The subject line was just 2 words: CEO alert. On board, the captain glanced at his tablet. His face paled. He turned to his first officer. "Did you know Jasmine Wilson is in 2A? The first officer shook his head slowly. "She owns us now," Reynolds muttered. He stood up. Jasmine in seat 2A closed her eyes. She knew what was coming, not because she hoped, because she planned it. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit with the calm gravity of a man who'd seen turbulence far worse than anything the skies could offer. But what he faced now wasn't mechanical, it was cultural, and it had been silently corroding the airline he had served loyally for over 2 decades. As he approached the galley, he spotted Brittany and the lead flight attendant laughing quietly. Their voices dropped when they saw him, but the tension didn't escape his notice. "Meeting," he said simply. The authority in his tone silenced everything. The curtain was pulled closed. Passengers could still see shadows, outlines of the crew shifting nervously, unsure of what was unfolding. Inside the galley, Captain Reynolds looked each crew member in the eye. His voice dropped to a low, cutting whisper. "Do you know who's seated in 2A? The crew exchanged glances. "She's the woman who caused the scene about the meal," Brittany said quickly. "She was filming being disruptive. We were just trying to maintain the service standard." "She wasn't disruptive," he replied. "She's Jasmine Wilson." Silence. Blank stares. The Jasmine Wilson, founder of Myra Tech, majority shareholder of Atlantic Airways as of this morning, the woman who owns the airline you're standing in. Brittany's jaw slackened. The lead attendant choked out a breath. "She's the one," yes, Reynolds said, more deliberate now. "And I have been instructed directly by Chairman Thompson to ensure she exits this flight first safely and that a formal apology is delivered." On the ground, law enforcement and company executives are already preparing a response team. Whatever happened up here, whatever you did, it's already being reviewed. No one spoke, because what could they say? They had laughed. They had slapped her. They had mocked her with stale bread and ignored her for 3 hours. They had done all of it under the assumption that she was powerless, unconnected, invisible. Captain Reynolds wasn't here to give them a pep talk. He was here to draw a line in the clouds before Jasmine Wilson and after. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Jasmine pulled out her tablet and began reviewing the camera feed. Atlantic Airways had been her target for acquisition for months, not because of profitability, but because of potential. A once revered airline now ranking in the bottom third for minority customer satisfaction. She had examined hundreds of complaints, internal audits, ignored whistleblower reports. But nothing compared to experiencing the rot from within. The system didn't need an audit, it needed an exorcism. She reviewed footage from her concealed recording, syncing it with audio from the aircraft's internal surveillance. Every moment from the dropped amenity kit to Brittany's slap was crystal clear. Nothing was left to speculation. As she quietly assembled the timeline, a notification pinged from her secure server. Phase 2 upload, complete ethics violation dossier. She tapped the file. Names, incidents, patterns. It wasn't just Brittany or the lead attendant. This crew had a documented history ignored by HR, buried by mid-tier supervisors, and excused with the language of misunderstanding. This wasn't personal, it was systemic. And now it would become public. On the ground, Malik was already coordinating with legal. A press release was being drafted. Not the sanitized, cautious language of PR, but a hard statement of values. Atlantic Airways does not tolerate discrimination. Today we begin again. Meanwhile, in seat 4B, a marketing executive from another airline leaned forward, whispering to the woman beside him. "That's her," he said. "That's Jasmine Wilson. I read about the merger. She's not just powerful. She's the one shaking up the whole industry." In 6C, a travel journalist who had once written about luxury flight experiences discreetly began taking notes. Something was happening. Something big. The culture of unchecked arrogance in elite service was facing its reckoning. And Jasmine, with her calm posture and laser focus, was the catalyst. Back in the galley, Captain Reynolds spoke once more to the crew. You will address her as Miss Wilson. You will remain professional. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not make excuses. Brittany, pale and trembling, nodded weakly. The lead attendant was already blinking back tears, but it was too late. The intercom dinged. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our descent into JFK. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and ensure your trays are stowed. As passengers shuffled unaware of the storm about to break, Jasmine composed one final message on her tablet. To Atlantic Airways, Executive Team RE Flight 247. Immediate action, required summary of violations attached. Recommend full leadership review, immediate staff suspension, and public accountability protocol. She hit send. Then she folded her tablet, adjusted her jacket, and exhaled. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't broken down. She hadn't retaliated. She had simply revealed the truth. And when the doors opened at JFK, it wouldn't just be another arrival. It would be the beginning of Atlantic Airways' reckoning. When the aircraft wheels finally touched down at JFK, it wasn't with the usual sigh of arrival or collective anticipation for baggage claims and rideshares. It was a landing heavy with consequence, thick with silence. The hum of the jet engines as it taxied toward a private hangar area only heightened the unease spreading through the first-class cabin. Jasmine Wilson remained perfectly still in seat 2A. She didn't glance at the window, didn't adjust her seatbelt, didn't even blink. Her mind had shifted into the next phase timing exposure chain of command. The moment the landing gear hit the tarmac, her legal team had already begun assembling. A disciplinary review committee was being convened in a secured Manhattan office tower. She knew because she had ordered it 35 minutes ago from 37,000 feet. But while Jasmine was quiet in her calculation, the rest of the cabin had begun to stir. Not physically, most passengers still sat motionless, but emotionally, ethically. What they had just witnessed wasn't turbulence or even simple bias. It was structural contempt unfolding in real time. And now faces that had turned away earlier were turning again, this time with shame, discomfort, and for some awakening. The man in 1C, Mr. Davidson, the very executive who had received champagne wine pairings and elaborate appetizer service while Jasmine had been ignored, removed his glasses slowly and turned to look at her. I'm sorry, he said almost inaudibly, for not saying anything. Jasmine didn't react at first, but her eyes met his. There was no judgment in her gaze, only clarity. I understand, she said simply, but understanding wasn't the same as excusing. Behind her, a younger passenger, an aspiring lawyer who had silently documented much of the flight's events on her own phone, was now scrolling through her recordings. Her hands trembled as she realized what she had captured. The slap, the refusal of service, the verbal contempt. She hadn't known who Jasmine was either, but now watching the videos, she saw what her law textbooks had failed to teach her. Real power doesn't have to raise its voice, it just has to be heard once. 2 rows back, a black couple in their late 50s exchanged a quiet look. The husband reached for his wife's hand and squeezed it gently. Neither had spoken during the ordeal, fearful of retaliation, but they had watched every second. They had experienced versions of it all their lives. The glances, the assumptions, the second-guessing. But never had they seen someone stand with such poise and simultaneously hold so much unseen leverage. It's like watching a system unravel, the woman whispered. No, her husband replied. It's watching someone finally pull the thread. Even the cabin crew, now gathered awkwardly near the galley, could feel it, the shift in atmosphere. Gone was their earlier camaraderie. Gone were the private jokes and whispered criticisms. They now stood like statues, stiff with dread. Brittany, the source of it all, clutched her hands in front of her like a child awaiting discipline. She knew something irreversible had happened. And then the cabin door opened. It wasn't the usual ground staff who boarded. It was a representative from the Office of Airline Oversight, flanked by 2 security officers in Navy suits. The insignia on their jackets bore no airline branding. These weren't flight ops staff. These were federal regulators sent for one reason: when an incident was no longer internal. They said nothing at first. The agent in the center held a folder thick and marked confidential, regulatory action. He walked straight to Jasmine Wilson. Ms. Wilson, he said, voice professional, crisp. We're here on directive from the Civil Aviation Council in your office. The board has authorized immediate review proceedings. The captain has been briefed. May we escort you first for your safety and briefing? Of course, Jasmine said, but I want the cabin to hear something first. She stood slowly, deliberately. To passengers, to crew, to every bystander who had pretended to sleep, ignored the insults, and tried to erase her presence with silence. Many of you watched this unfold, and many of you stayed quiet. I understand why. Silence is easy. It feels safe. But today you saw what happens when silence meets power. Not violence, not anger, just truth documented, undeniable, and backed by accountability. She paused, letting her voice settle across the hushed space. And you now get to choose who you want to be tomorrow. Silent witness or someone who says, that's not right, even if no one else is. The words hung in the cabin like judgment, but also like an invitation. As she turned to leave, the silence broke. A single passenger, an older woman seated near the rear of first class, stood and softly applauded. Then another, and another. The sound grew, not raucous, not performative, but respectful, like the slow rising tide of conscience awakening. Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't need to. The system she had just exposed was crumbling behind her. And this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As Jasmine stepped into the private corridor, connecting the jet bridge to the restricted reception zone, the echoes of quiet applause behind her faded into a distant hum. The terminal's sterile lighting replaced the soft cabin glow, but her resolve remained unchanged. Flanked by two federal agents and the captain himself, Jasmine walked with the silent precision of someone who already knew what needed to happen. Awaiting her beyond the frosted glass security checkpoint was the interim crisis response unit, assembled only in extreme circumstances. At its helm stood Lydia Grant, a senior investigator from the Department of Transportation's Aviation Integrity Division, and Malcolm Everett, Jasmine's personal legal strategist, who had flown in from D.C. as soon as her initial encrypted message was sent midair. Ms. Wilson, Lydia greeted, shaking her hand with brisk efficiency. We've reviewed the surveillance footage. We've also retrieved cabin audio from the service areas. What we have confirms everything. Jasmine nodded, unfazed. Prepare the formal documentation for federal submission. I want FAA review initiated within 48 hours, already in progress. Malcolm added, sliding a sleek tablet across the desk. This contains synced timestamps of the verbal abuse, physical assault, and the coordinated meal denial. I've uploaded your in-flight recordings, and we now have access to the aircraft's internal communications, including the crew's headset chatter. Jasmine scrolled through a portion of the footage, her face unreadable, as she listened to the crew's casual dehumanization muttered under their breath. It wasn't just a lapse, it was a pattern. And now finally she had it on record with undeniable proof. This isn't just about discipline, she said quietly. This is an expose. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, chaos was unraveling. Word had spread among the remaining crew that Jasmine Wilson wasn't just any executive. She was the executive, their owner, their judge, their reckoning. Brittany sat slumped in the back alley, clutching a crumpled napkin and one trembling hand still visibly shaken. Around her, the atmosphere among the flight attendants had shifted from camaraderie to caution. No one dared speak openly now. Every whisper might be recorded, every glance misinterpreted. The once unspoken hierarchy of the cabin crew, who belonged, who didn't, who got extra perks, who was managed, had turned into a minefield. In first class, the man in seat 1C was no longer checking stock prices on his tablet. Instead, he stared at the blank screen, haunted by his own passivity. Beside him, the younger woman who had recorded parts of the incident opened her LinkedIn app, searching for Jasmine Wilson's profile. When it loaded, her breath caught. Forbes 40 under 40. Former Rhodes Scholar. Tech giant. Aviation investor. Now controlling shareholder of Jackson Atlantic Airways. She looked up from her screen, slowly realization dawning like sunrise over her sense of justice. In the adjacent terminal, Jasmine's internal crisis team had assembled in a secure conference room prepped by the airline board. Inside, a full task force, including PR consultants, human resources executives, and diversity ethics officers, awaited her input. She didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table. We're no longer dealing with a crew incident, she said. We are documenting a system failure. I want every passenger statement reviewed. Cross-check with previous complaints filed under similar circumstances. Any prior records of conduct from this crew must be reopened, and reevaluated, and begin reaching out to minority passengers from the past 12 months. If they had similar experiences, they deserve to be heard. The PR executive raised a hesitant hand. Ms. Wilson, the optics, this could snowball into major brand damage. Let it, Jasmine answered coldly. We don't need to protect our reputation. We need to earn one. From a far screen, Greg Fallon, her chief strategist, joined via encrypted video call. We've identified 9 prior complaints that name Brittany or her supervising staff. All were internally dismissed. 3 of those complaints used nearly identical language, ignored skipped for meals, no eye contact, hostile attitude. Compile a full discrimination pattern analysis, Jasmine instructed. We'll need it when we present findings to the FAA and the Civil Aviation Oversight Board. Back in the terminal, the press had begun circling like vultures. Whispers of a high-level incident on Flight 247 had leaked through unofficial channels. Photographers from 2 major newspapers had already spotted the unusual security convoy. Jasmine's team erected temporary barriers to ensure privacy, but they knew the story would soon break. The only question was, would it break controlled or explosive? Lydia returned to Jasmine with a new development. A whistleblower just emailed us, she said. One of the junior attendants, his name's Evan, he says he witnessed Brittany's behavior in the galley conversation. He's willing to testify. We're securing his statement now. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of grim satisfaction glinting within them. Good, she said. The system is cracking from the inside. That's when you know the truth's about to come out. Evan's signed statement arrived within the hour, time-stamped and corroborated by audio logs. He detailed Brittany's casual dismissal of Jasmine, her inflammatory comments about people who don't belong, and her boastful recounting of putting the woman in her place. It was all there, on paper, under oath, and the scale of what had happened was beginning to take form, not just a single bad apple, but a rotten supply chain of unchecked bias and structural disrespect. In that moment, Jasmine knew this wasn't just about her being targeted. This was about everyone who ever had been and had no power to respond. That time was over. The conference room had grown still. Jasmine stood at the edge of the glass window overlooking the tarmac where Flight 247 had just rolled into its final gate. Her reflection, sharp composed, stared back at her. This was the moment everything converged: her role as executive, as victim, as witness, and now as the catalyst for confrontation. Has the full board arrived? She asked. Malcolm nodded. Yes, all 12 members are in the executive briefing chamber waiting. Jasmine didn't speak. She adjusted her blazer, smoothing the navy fabric along her sleeve, and turned with deliberate calm. Then let's begin. They moved together through a private corridor beneath the terminal, escorted by internal security FAA liaisons and Jasmine's legal chief. On their way, Jasmine received a secure ping on her phone, an alert from her PR director. Media containment holding but leaking fast. Local news just received tip of flight misconduct involving executive. Prepare a statement for public release. 2 lines only, Jasmine said. Acknowledge the incident. Emphasize investigation and accountability. Greg Fallon messaged back within seconds. Understood. Messaging locked. Will synchronize with internal memo after board session concludes. At precisely 11:00 a.m., Jasmine stepped into the executive briefing chamber on the 33rd floor of the Atlantic Airways Tower. The board sat around a dark walnut table, its polish reflecting back attention none of them dared voice. Chairman Thompson rose as she entered, but Jasmine waved him gently back into his seat. No pleasantries, she said, placing a single folder on the table. We're here for truth and action. She opened the folder. Inside, still images captured from the cabin video, statements from passengers, and crew transcripts from the cockpit log and the whistleblower report from Evan. She let them sit with the documents for a moment, watching their faces tighten, shift, blanch. The passenger you saw denied champagne, denied a meal, slapped in the face, and accused of aggression. Jasmine began, was your new CEO. Me. The incident occurred during a flight I took to quietly audit our first-class operations and finalize our acquisition transition. A pause. Not a single board member spoke. I expected to find cultural tension, she continued. What I found was institutional rot. She tapped the folder. These behaviors weren't isolated. They were systemic, condoned by a lack of accountability, shielded by poor documentation, and an internal HR structure designed to protect the company, not the passengers. One director, Theodore Langley, cleared his throat. Jasmine, we had no idea the situation on Flight 247 had escalated this far. If we had, you'd have done what Jasmine interrupted, not harshly, but with surgical precision. Posted an apology, suspended a staffer, had legal draw-up settlement terms, and kept the culture intact. Langley fell silent. Jasmine turned to Greg, who projected the surveillance footage onto the embedded wall display. The room dimmed slightly as the images rolled. Brittany's meal tray slammed onto Jasmine's table, the slap echoing in front of stunned passengers. The crew's laughter in the galley afterward. A few directors looked away. This is what we are, Jasmine said coldly. Not what we claim to be. What we are when no one is watching, or when we think the passenger in 2A is just another woman who doesn't belong. The room was silent. Chairman Thompson finally broke it. What do you propose? Jasmine reached into her briefcase and pulled out a second folder marked Restructure Phase 1. Effective immediately, she said, I'm initiating full executive restructuring under the authority granted in our acquisition contract. She handed out copies. 6 executive positions will be vacated by end of week. PR, customer experience, in-flight services, HR policy, and 2 regional VPs responsible for cabin operations. Replacements will be drawn from a cross-functional leadership pool with hiring oversight by a third-party equity committee. Wait, Langley interjected. You're bypassing standard HR review? No, Jasmine replied. I'm removing HR from the process entirely until we verify they haven't covered up dozens of complaints. Another director, Marissa Chang, glanced at the documents. Jasmine, this is massive. So is the liability, she snapped. So is the brand risk. So is the moral failure. A beat passed. Then she softened just slightly. I'm not here to burn the airline down. I'm here to rebuild it. Greg advanced to the final slide, a visual timeline titled The 90-Day Integrity Rebuild. Milestones included mandatory retraining and open apology campaign, media briefings, a new whistleblower portal, and monthly reporting dashboards shared publicly. I want us to lead the industry, Jasmine said. Not because we're afraid of lawsuits, but because we owe it to our passengers, to our crew, and to every person who's ever boarded our planes and wondered if they were seen. There was no more opposition. Chairman Thompson finally stood again, this time without hesitation. You have our support, he said. The board will sign off on full authorization. Jasmine gave a small nod. I wasn't asking. Then with measured grace, she closed the folder, locked eyes with each person in the room, and added, You'll either help change the system or be changed by it. The boardroom was dead silent, but inside that silence, a new power had taken root. The next 72 hours unfolded like a controlled demolition, deliberate, strategic, unrelenting. At 6:00 a.m., the following morning, Jasmine Wilson convened a cross-functional task force inside the Executive Control Center at Atlantic Airways headquarters. The room, nicknamed the flight deck, was now a war room, each digital screen displaying real-time data across customer complaints, internal HR files, flight performance, and cabin crew logs from the past 18 months. Begin the sweep, Jasmine instructed. Greg Fallon, her chief operating strategist, keyed in a command sequence that lit the dashboard in red and blue metrics. His custom-coded algorithm, codenamed Pulse Check, launched a full-spectrum review of personnel behavior anomalies, including keyword sentiment and customer feedback, incident, escalation patterns, and unresolved HR cases tagged non-actionable. First flag 6 mid-level HR reps closed 21 race-related complaints in under 48 hours without passenger follow-up, Greg reported. All routed through the same internal review queue. Shut that pipeline down, Jasmine said instantly. Permanently. Reassign oversight to our interim ethics auditor. Another notification popped on the screen. Director of Cabin Experience, Harold Keating. He's been personally overriding service violation reports, reclassifying them as crew fatigue or passenger misunderstanding, Greg added. Schedule a direct call. I want his resignation on my desk before noon. Jasmine replied. By 9:00 a.m., word had spread throughout the company. Jasmine Wilson was not simply reacting to her in-flight assault. She was disassembling the entire power structure that allowed it to happen. At airports across the country, flight crews began hearing whispers that Flight 247's fallout had become a company-wide purge. Crew members who had once shared private jokes about premium class policing now found themselves logging into mandatory retraining modules and equity briefings with visible unease. In Atlanta, Miami, Chicago, and Los Angeles, senior staff walked into scheduled meetings only to find legal observers and compliance officers waiting. Each session began the same way. You've been identified in a pattern review. We need to ask you about specific service discrepancies in prior incident documentation. In New York, Jasmine sat face-to-face with a room of public relations executives. The energy was tense. This can't look like revenge, one of the consultants warned her. If the narrative becomes CEO punishes airline for personal grievance, we lose the public. Jasmine leaned forward slowly. This isn't personal, it's structural. And if we don't admit that publicly, we lose more than the public, we lose our future. She pushed a folder across the table. Release this, the timeline of every documented customer service disparity in first class over the last 2 years. Redact names but not behavior. Show our own data. Show the truth. The room went quiet. You're putting that in the press release, the lead strategist asked. I'm putting it in history, Jasmine replied. This is the correction. Let it sting. That afternoon, Atlantic Airways made headlines again, not from a scandal, but from a choice. Their official statement read, following internal investigation and leadership transition, Atlantic Airways acknowledges systemic failures in equitable treatment across service classes. Under the direction of CEO Jasmine Wilson, we are launching a full operational overhaul designed to restore dignity, transparency, and fairness to every passenger who boards our aircraft. The media exploded. Networks that had once speculated about Jasmine's in-flight experience now ran exclusive segments on her reform agenda. Cable news hosts debated the ethics of executive power being used to correct social wrongs. Online forums flooded with the passengers sharing their own stories, many eerily similar to Jasmine's. I once had a first-class ticket and was told I had to prove it 3 times. They skipped me for champagne too. Thought I imagined it. Now I know I didn't. It always starts with a look, like you're not supposed to be here, like you borrowed someone else's life. The hashtag #2A effect trended for over 48 hours. By Friday, an emergency shareholders meeting was called. Jasmine entered the glass atrium conference hall, where over 300 investors waited. She wore the same blazer from Flight 247, her statement unspoken but unmistakable. No performance, no dramatics, just unflinching resolve. She stood before the microphone. There are 2 paths forward, she began. We can pretend this was a bad day, an anomaly, blame it on a crew, fire some people, hide in PR. Or, she let the pause linger. We can acknowledge that our airline, our culture was quietly rewarding the wrong instincts for years, and that it took one passenger in one seat at the wrong moment to prove it. Murmurs spread across the room. She continued, I'm not here to protect our brand. I'm here to rebuild it, not for better optics, for better outcomes. When she finished, the hall remained silent for 5 seconds before the room broke into applause. Not thunderous, but sustained, enough to know they were with her. At the same hour, NYPD formally charged flight attendant Brittany and the lead stewardess from Flight 247 with assault and falsifying reports. Jasmine declined to pursue civil charges, choosing instead to let the justice system and internal review board complete their work. Back in her office that evening, Jasmine stared at her inbox. Hundreds of messages had poured in from former employees, passengers, airline analysts, even competing CEOs. But it was one email that caught her eye, a subject line that read, You sat in 2A. I sat in 3B. I never said anything. I should have. I'm sorry. It was signed at Michael D., fellow passenger Flight 247. Jasmine closed the email. Her expression was unreadable. This wasn't victory. This was collapse of silence, of complicity, of a system too long left unchecked. And in that collapse, something new was ready to rise. By the following week, the collapse had made room for something Jasmine Wilson had spent her entire executive life preparing for, but had never been granted the full authority to execute until now: cultural rebirth. Inside the newly renamed Equity Operations Hub, formerly the Customer Relations Division, Jasmine stood in front of a sleek black conference screen with a team of newly promoted directors seated before her. None of them had held executive titles prior to her takeover, and none of them had ever been invited into a leadership discussion at the airline despite years of performance excellence. Now they were the architects of the new Atlantic Airways. No more training modules for compliance, Jasmine said, pacing slowly. We're not checking boxes anymore. We're changing behavior. Each of the 12 directors represented a different sector of the company, from in-flight services to pilot recruitment, from tech infrastructure to crisis response. They'd been selected for their ability to speak truth even when inconvenient. What happened on Flight 247 is the blueprint, Jasmine continued, not the discrimination. The response. When systems fail, it's not just a personnel problem, it's a permissions problem. And starting today, we revoke permission to ignore dignity. She tapped her tablet. On the wall, a real-time dashboard came to life. Red dots represented flagged incidents across flights, terminals, lounges, and crew operations. Our new monitoring AI, Jasmine explained, identifies language patterns, timing gaps in service, and behavioral anomalies across routes. It doesn't replace human oversight, but it removes human bias from first-line analysis. And when it flags a flight, it notifies 3 departments simultaneously: ethics, training, and me. One of the new directors, a former gate agent named Alicia Ramos, raised her hand. Won't staff see this as surveillance? They already are, Jasmine admitted. But we're not hiding it. We're broadcasting it. We're saying we're watching but not to punish. That night, internal memos went out to every employee. The subject line was simple: we begin again. The message beneath it outlined 3 sweeping changes. 1. Every employee, every year, from executives to tarmac crew, and all staff would undergo mandatory immersive empathy labs. No passive videos. These were in-person simulations, customer experience walkthroughs, and crisis de-escalation labs run by behavioral psychologists and veteran flight instructors. 2. Passenger Bill of Dignity, a public charter posted on every aircraft, every gate, and inside every app interface. It wasn't just policy, it was promise. The first line read, respect is not luxury, it is baseline. 3. No fear whistleblowing. Anonymous internal reporting lines were connected to outside audit teams. Employees could report supervisors or colleagues without fear of retaliation. And if a retaliation claim surfaced, it was investigated at the CEO level. The media ate it up. What had started as a corporate scandal was evolving into an industry revolution. News anchors who had covered the slap heard round the cabin were now praising the Wilson Doctrine, a phrase coined by a business ethics professor at Columbia. Meanwhile, the crew from Flight 247 had become national symbols of caution. Brittany, the former flight attendant, had lawyered up. Her legal team tried to spin the event as a miscommunication, then as a mental health episode. But the footage, the audio, and the statements from passengers told a different story. Her case became a topic of debate on Sunday political shows and corporate town halls, like what happens when someone used to unchecked power finally faces consequence. But Jasmine didn't stay in the spotlight. She returned to the shadows, reviewing passenger feedback, visiting crew lounges unannounced, and boarding red-eye flights, not as CEO but as an observer. On one such flight, seated in 5A under an alias, she watched a new hire named Malik calmly de-escalate a passenger conflict about overhead bin space. "No worries, sir," Malik said gently to an older man grumbling about a misplaced bag. "Let me make this right for you." He smiled, not performatively, but genuinely. And when the passenger muttered something Jasmine had heard before, "These new hires don't know their place," Malik didn't flinch. He simply responded, "My place is to make your flight more comfortable, sir. That's why I'm here." Jasmine didn't intervene. She didn't identify herself. But when the plane landed, she left a handwritten note in the galley. "To Malik, you embody the future of this airline. Thank you for showing grace under pressure. You'll hear from us soon." 3 days later, Malik was promoted. Elsewhere, stories like his started multiplying. A hijabi gate agent reported being defended by a white supervisor after a passenger refused to be helped by someone like her. A trans pilot posted a photo captioned, "First flight without fear." It went viral. The old culture was crumbling, quietly but definitively. And the new one, it wasn't just being enforced from the top, it was being adopted from within. Aviation blogs began referring to it as the Jasmine Standard, a set of principles that made staff proud to wear their badges again. And for passengers, especially those long ignored or disrespected, the shift was visible. They weren't just tolerated, they were welcomed, acknowledged, respected. because someone had drawn a line not in anger, not in vengeance, but in resolve. And everything past that line had to change. As the aircraft cruised silently over the Atlantic, the cabin's dimmed lights cast elongated shadows across first class. Jasmine Wilson sat upright in seat 2A, her face calm but her mind racing. The tray of congealed pasta remained untouched before her, a silent testament to the indignity she had endured. Around her, the air was thick with tension, a manufactured calm that failed to mask the raw discomfort pulsing beneath the surface. Brittany stood near the galley, arms crossed, whispering to the other flight attendants. Her voice had lost its performative confidence, replaced now by short-clipped bursts of anxious disbelief. The moment Jasmine had revealed she was documenting the flight, the crew's posture shifted. Where once they projected dominance, now they radiated unease. Jasmine reached for her tablet and began typing a real-time incident log. Not for legal reasons, though that would follow, but for precision. Every detail, every phrase, every omission, every microaggression recorded as it had occurred. Her strokes were steady, her hands unaffected by the sting still lingering from the slap that had redrawn the power lines in that cabin. The businessman seated across the aisle kept glancing over his posture, stiffer now, his food less interesting. He had laughed earlier. He wasn't laughing now. Others who had silently watched the scene unfold were now processing something deeper than awkwardness. They had seen it. They knew. This wasn't about bad service anymore. As Jasmine finished logging her final observation, the captain's voice broke through the hum of the engines. His tone was different, measured, formal, and distant from the usual mid-flight pleasantries. "Flight attendants, please report to the galley." The announcement stirred a ripple across the cabin. No one moved. Even those unfamiliar with airline protocol could feel it. This was not a routine check-in. In the galley, Brittany straightened her spine, but her eyes betrayed her. She glanced toward the back of the cabin, then toward Jasmine, then away again. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the lead flight attendant appeared at the curtain, her face tight, her eyes searching. She did not make eye contact with Jasmine. She didn't need to. Jasmine's silence was louder than any confrontation. Jasmine folded the tablet cover slowly, her actions calm, deliberate. It was the kind of quiet only someone fully in control could exude. She wasn't rushing to escalate. She wasn't begging for dignity. She already had it. She was letting the system hang itself in its own ropes. The curtain to the galley twitched again. A younger attendant shone a peek through. Her face looked pale, as if she'd just been told the truth that would unravel everything. She stepped back quickly, almost as if Jasmine's gaze alone was enough to make her flee. From somewhere at the back of the plane, whispers began to stir. Words like CEO ownership lawsuit passed between rows like sparks in dry brush. Even passengers in economy had started to notice the unnatural silence radiating from the first-class section. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was gravity. Jasmine leaned back, clasped her hands on her lap, and looked out the window. Below her, the ocean stretched black and still, a mirror of the power she now held. She didn't feel victorious. She felt necessary. Power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just takes notes. As the aircraft coasted steadily over the Atlantic, Flight 247 entered its final 3 hours toward JFK International. A hush had blanketed the first-class cabin, a silence not of luxury, but of anticipation. Passengers weren't asleep. They were watching, pretending not to. Jasmine Wilson, seated in 2A, wasn't pretending anything. She had already shifted from passenger to executive, and from observer to architect of consequence. She tapped her encrypted satellite messenger, the screen dimmed to keep the glow low. A single message to her chief of legal strategy at Wilson Global Holdings read, "Preliminary review complete. Proceed with standard response protocol. Confirm if ground team is assembled." The message sent silently. No alerts, no dramatic fanfare. Just the slow churn of a corporate machine waking up beneath her fingertips. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds received another message from the ground. It was short but jarring. CEO Jasmine Wilson on board. Confirm protection protocol. Prepare for secure disembarkation. The confirmation rattled him. He had heard whispers about the new shareholder shakeup, but he hadn't known it was her. Not until now, and certainly not under these circumstances. Back in the galley, the crew was beginning to fracture. Brittany's voice had gone from loud to shrill. She was pacing in tight circles, checking her watch every few minutes, asking the lead attendant if legal was going to get involved, and what's the worst they can really do? Her tone was one of false bravado, a person trying to talk over the sound of her own unraveling. The lead attendant, Dana, had grown quiet. She knew the moment had passed from maybe this blows over to we're going to lose our jobs. She had seen too many internal memos before war, how the airline handled optics, how they handled complaints. But this wasn't a complaint. This was an operation in motion. Jasmine hadn't made a scene. She'd made a case. The younger flight attendants had stopped siding with Brittany. They watched her now like a fire they couldn't extinguish, one they feared might burn them by proximity. Even Shauna, who had laughed along earlier, now stood near the galley curtain, chewing her lip, casting furtive glances toward Jasmine's seat like a child fearing judgment. A new message lit up Jasmine's screen. Legal ready, HR standing by. Media contact prepared if escalation required. She responded with a single word, hold. She wasn't done observing. The meal carts were locked. No dessert service followed. No wine refills. The performance of luxury had ended. In its place was a vacuum, no one quite sure what came next. Some passengers had removed their headphones. A few glanced toward Jasmine, curious now. Not out of voyeurism, but because they were beginning to sense they were part of something larger than just a bad flight. Across the aisle, the white businessman from earlier finally spoke. His tone was softer, sheepish even. I didn't realize, he said quietly, not meeting Jasmine's eyes, that they hadn't served you, or that. He trailed off. His sentence couldn't hold the weight of what had happened. Jasmine gave a simple nod. Not angry, not forgiving, just acknowledging reality. Thank you, she said. It was unclear whether she was thanking him for his words or simply acknowledging that he'd finally seen. From the galley, Brittany emerged again, straightening her uniform with the discipline of a soldier about to face judgment. She approached Jasmine's seat, but the moment her eyes locked with Jasmine's, something inside her broke. She paused mid-step, then turned back. She couldn't do it. Jasmine's presence had become too much. Not because she was intimidating, but because she was unshakably calm. Brittany had been prepared to fight outrage, not face composure. The tension crested when the cockpit door opened and Captain Reynolds stepped out for the second time in his 30-year career. He walked down the aisle past business class, past the curtain, and stopped at 2A. Every eye followed him. He didn't kneel. He didn't grandstand. He simply stood straight, his hat in one hand, his words chosen with the utmost care. Miss Wilson, he said quietly, you have my sincerest apology. I was unaware. That's no excuse. I promise you your concerns have not gone unnoted. Jasmine studied his face. He was sincere, tired. A man trying to hold authority in a world that had already shifted beneath his boots. Thank you, Captain, she replied. Let's land the plane. He nodded and returned to the cockpit. Jasmine reached into her handbag and retrieved a slim black case, the type used by legal consultants and board members. She unzipped it, revealing a contract already signed, one that had been pre-prepared for the scenario that unfolded today. It contained internal policy amendments, crew restructuring rights, and an executive memo labeled Involuntary Termination Protocol, Class A Incidents. The ink had dried days ago. Jasmine closed the case. The descent had begun. As Flight 247 dipped below 20,000 feet, a quiet tension rippled through the first-class cabin, not the kind that comes from turbulence, but from inevitability. The passengers sensed that something monumental was coming. Every eye subtly darted toward Jasmine Wilson. No one dared speak aloud what they now suspected, but the silence between glances was filled with awareness. Jasmine remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was the same as it had been at the start of the flight, regal-centered, untouchable. But now the entire environment responded differently to her stillness. This wasn't just about her anymore. She had become a symbol of power, veiled in restraint, of a reckoning carried out without shouting. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds radioed ahead to JFK's command control. Tower Flight 247 requesting clearance to Gate 33 private auxiliary per protocol. There was a pause before the voice responded, crisp and alert. Flight 247 confirmed. Gate 33 prepped for restricted deplaning. External security en route. Escort detail ready. Proceed as directed. The captain exhaled slowly. He glanced back toward the cabin, as if he could feel the weight of what was about to unfold trailing him like a shadow. He didn't know the exact extent of what had happened in the cabin, Only fragments passed through hushed whispers on among the crew. But the name Jasmine Wilson was enough. And her silence, that was louder than anything Brittany had shouted. In the galley, Brittany stood rigid, frozen mid-task. She was trying to prepare hot towels, but couldn't keep her hands from trembling. Dana, the lead attendant, leaned against the counter, arms folded, trying to pretend composure. But she'd been in aviation too long not to see the signs. "Have you checked the internal cabin report logs?" Dana asked under her breath. "Yeah," Brittany whispered back. "But I didn't log it." "You didn't log anything?" Dana's voice was low, but the tremor in it betrayed her rising panic. "I didn't think it was serious," Brittany muttered. Dana closed her eyes. She had flown too many hours to not recognize the fatal error. No internal report meant no preemptive defense, and now they were defenseless. In first class, Jasmine tapped her tablet, opening a secure app interface designed for real-time personnel arbitration. A new message blinked into view. Media units confirmed outside JFK. Legal and compliance on site. Police en route to tarmac. Proceed at your discretion. She typed one word: execute. Back on the ground, a team of 12 professionals in tailored Navy jackets moved through Terminal 5. Half were legal compliance officers. The other half were high-level HR investigators from Atlantic Airways, dispatched on direct order from the chairman. A final figure moved silently at the back of the group, her presence unannounced. Victoria Grant, Director of Public Accountability, known inside the company as the fire starter. Her job wasn't to fix problems. It was to eliminate the people who caused them. As the plane descended, the atmosphere inside grew dense. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The businessman across from Jasmine put away his laptop and finally met her gaze. "I was part of the problem," he said softly. "I saw it happening and I said nothing." Jasmine didn't flinch. "Then be part of the solution," she replied. The words hit him like a blueprint. He nodded once slowly. Not in defense, not in excuse, but in understanding. 30 rows back, a young black woman in economy who hadn't seen the slap, but had heard the whispers, leaned across the aisle to a Latino father with his toddler. "Something's going on in first class," she whispered. The man nodded. "It's about time someone stood up." As the landing gear lowered, Brittany finally cracked. "What do we do?" she asked Dana, her voice pitched and frantic. "Maybe we can explain it. Maybe we say she's the CEO," Dana said flatly. "You slapped the CEO of the company." Brittany stared at her. "She didn't say that. She didn't say who she was. She didn't have to," Dana replied. On the tarmac, the motorcade waited in perfect alignment. Two unmarked black SUVs, a silver Mercedes Sprinter van marked compliance, and 3 NYPD cruisers. Behind the tinted glass of the SUV sat an executive assistant holding a printed memo with 3 names circled in red: Brittany Rowe, Dana Wallace, and Susan Powell. A few rows behind Jasmine, a woman finally broke the silence. "I saw the slap," she said loudly. "I saw everything," another voice chimed in. "I heard her get denied food. I thought it was a mistake at first." More voices followed, rising not in accusation, but in confession. "We let it happen. I looked away. I thought maybe she was staff." Jasmine didn't react. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out a black folder with the Atlantic Airways seal. She placed it gently on her tray table, untouched. The wheels touched down. As the aircraft taxied toward the far gate, the airport slowly faded from view. The plane curved toward the private terminal, and with every foot closer, the temperature in the crew galley dropped 10 degrees. Over the intercom, Captain Reynolds made the final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated. Disembarkation will occur under executive direction. Thank you for your cooperation." No clapping, no movement, no familiar rustle of passengers reaching for bags. Brittany's voice shook. "Dana, what do we say?" "We don't say anything now," Dana whispered. "Now, we listen." Outside, the black-suited team began moving toward the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, Jasmine Wilson sat upright, her chin slightly raised. The plane had landed, but the reckoning was only beginning. The wheels of Flight 247 had barely stopped rolling before the first ripple of movement began outside. The jet bridge extended slowly, but this wasn't a standard deplaning. It was choreography, deliberate, cold, and strategic. Jasmine Wilson remained in her seat, unmoved, her tray table still down, the black Atlantic Airways folder untouched atop it like a verdict waiting to be delivered. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds stood adjusting his cuffs with quiet precision. His voice over the intercom had been calm, but his jaw now set with a grim understanding. He had never seen a flight unravel like this, not because of turbulence or engine failure, but because of a cultural collapse happening in real time. He stepped out into the cabin. There were no jokes, this time no reassurances, just silence. Behind him, the door to the aircraft opened with a mechanical hiss. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped aboard, flanking a sharply dressed woman with silver-gray braids tied in a low bun. Victoria Grant, her expression was unreadable, her presence commanding. She didn't pause to look around or acknowledge the murmurs that swelled like waves against the walls of the cabin. She walked directly to Jasmine Wilson's seat. "Miss Wilson," she said quietly. Jasmine rose with the same elegance she had displayed boarding the plane. Without a word, she handed the black folder to Victoria. Victoria opened it, scanned the first page, and nodded once. "Thank you. We'll handle the rest." Jasmine turned toward the front of the plane, pausing only to nod at Captain Reynolds. Her gaze met his with an unspoken understanding. Professionalism is not a title. It is a responsibility. Then she stepped into the jet bridge and disappeared from view. That was when the silence broke. Victoria turned on her heel. "Flight attendants," she said. "To the galley, now." There was no confusion in her voice. No room for resistance. Brittany, Dana, and the remaining crew shuffled toward the galley, their composure cracking. The businessman in 3A pulled out his phone and silently began recording. So did the woman in 4D. The witnesses had decided not to stay silent this time. In the galley, Victoria waited. "What you did today," she began, her voice low but laced with steel, "was not a failure of service. It was a failure of humanity." Brittany opened her mouth, but Victoria raised a single hand. "You're not here to explain. You're here to receive instruction." Behind her, the security officers stepped forward. "As of this moment," she continued, "you are suspended from duty pending formal investigation. You will hand over your credentials, ID badges, and uniforms to security." Dana gasped. "Right here. You are making us strip our titles in front of the passengers. You stripped yourselves of dignity when you denied it to someone else," Victoria replied. One by one, the crew surrendered their badges, their epaulets, their name tags. It wasn't the humiliation that broke them, it was the public accountability. The moment they realized this wasn't being swept under the rug. This wasn't an internal memo. This was justice walking the aisles with a clipboard. From behind the curtain, passengers watched. The same crew who had strutted the cabin with clipped smiles and smug authority now looked like interns being walked out of a boardroom. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. In economy, whispers moved row to row. "Did you hear what she said? That was the CEO. She owns the whole airline. She got slapped, and she didn't even raise her voice." As Brittany walked down the aisle toward the front door, her expression collapsed completely. Her mascara had run slightly, her jaw tight with unspoken words. But no apology came. Not yet. When she reached the exit, she paused, facing the remaining passengers who had witnessed it all. But Jasmine Wilson was no longer there. Only the silence of consequences remained. Outside the aircraft, Victoria approached the waiting executives from Atlantic Airways. Chairman Thompson was among them, flanked by board members with rigid spines and stiff suits. "It's done," she said. "Are they in custody?" he asked. "They're in transition. The full incident has been documented, passenger statements, onboard video, Jasmine's recordings. There's no ambiguity, and the press contained for now. But it won't stay that way." Inside the airport, a designated conference room had been transformed into a temporary tribunal. HR, legal, and compliance officers stood ready to take statements. Officers from NYPD's Special Investigations Unit waited just outside the door. Dana and Brittany were escorted inside, heads, lowered, hands still trembling. Jasmine did not attend the disciplinary meeting. She didn't need to. Her presence was already embedded in every moment of this case. Her evidence, her silence, her restraint. The real punishment had already been delivered in those moments when they realized who she was and how little she needed to raise her voice to command an empire. Back on the tarmac, ground crew began unloading the plane. Flight 247 was late, but no one mentioned the delay. Not the passengers who deplaned in a hush of reverence, not the media who had been kept behind the cordon, not the security officers who quietly led the disgraced attendants to a holding area. The only sound was the hum of the engines winding down and the slow, deliberate footfalls of those still processing what had happened. In the first-class lounge, Jasmine met with her executive aide. She didn't speak of the slap. She didn't mention the food. She only said, "I want the training accelerated. I want every cabin crew member retrained within 90 days. Yes, ma'am, and public transparency. No more closed-door incidents. Let the customers see we're fixing what was broken." The aide paused. "Should we make a statement to the press now?" "No," Jasmine said, sipping her water. "Let the silence speak first. Let them feel what it's like when real power doesn't have to announce itself." The aide nodded and stepped away. Jasmine stared out the glass wall at the jet she had just exited. A simple flight, a routine ticket, a seat in 2A, and it had detonated a system of quiet prejudice built over decades. The reckoning had landed. The next morning, the skyline of New York City was still veiled in a soft gray mist when Jasmine Wilson stepped into the headquarters of Atlantic Airways. Located at the corner of Park Avenue and East 48th, the building had long been a symbol of the airline's prestige, but behind its glass curtain walls and polished stone reception sat a culture decades out of step with the values it claimed to represent. This would be Jasmine's first day in the CEO's office, not as an investor or board member, but as the operational leader of a company that had embarrassed itself at 38,000 feet. She didn't take the executive elevator. She walked through the front door like any employee, flanked by her chief of staff and two advisors. In the lobby, receptionists froze mid-conversation. Some stood instinctively. A hush followed her footsteps all the way to the private access corridor. The only sound was the echo of heels on tile. She had no interest in ceremony, no ribbon cutting, no welcoming committee. Her arrival, much like her leadership, would be silent but seismic. Upstairs, the executive boardroom had been hastily prepared. Atlantic's most senior officers sat in a rigid semicircle around the matte black table. Some had barely slept. Others were still in denial about the gravity of what had transpired the day before. They had all seen the footage by now, some from leaked clips on social media, others from Jasmine's own internal brief. When she entered the room, they stood. She didn't ask them to sit. "Good morning," Jasmine said, setting her leather portfolio on the table without looking up. "We're not going to pretend today is business as usual." Her voice was low, composed, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "Yesterday, I boarded one of our aircraft with a first-class ticket in Platinum Elite status. I was denied basic service, publicly humiliated, and physically assaulted by a member of the flight crew. Not because of my title, but because of my skin." A beat of silence. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. The chief legal officer scribbled something, eyes down. Only the head of HR met her gaze directly. "I didn't come here for apologies," Jasmine continued. "Apologies are what companies use when they plan to do nothing." She pressed a button on the conference room control pad. The center screen flickered to life, displaying the now infamous video, a freeze frame of Brittany's outstretched hand, mid-slap, Jasmine's expression unreadable. "We're going to make this moment cost something." She tapped again. The screen shifted to a color-coded organizational chart. Red nodes marked every executive who had signed off on the prior escalation-de-escalation protocol. The internal memo that Jasmine discovered instructed crews to control perception in premium cabins, to maintain a standard image. The language was coded, but the implication had always been clear. "Effective immediately, I am suspending all leadership involved in the drafting, reviewing, or approving of this policy pending external audit," Jasmine said flatly. Gasps followed. The chief operating officer paled. The PR director dropped his pen. "You can't just suspend people without board approval," someone muttered. Jasmine looked up slowly. "You may want to review our updated operating agreement," she said. She pulled a second document from her portfolio. Omnicore's revised shareholder contract, granting her interim executive authority in moments of cultural breach. It had been inserted during the acquisition, approved by the very people now scrambling to understand what they had signed. A deathly silence followed. Then she turned to the head of human resources. "How many complaints have you received over the last 5 years related to racial bias in premium cabins?" The woman flipped through a folder, her hands shaking slightly. "A total of 73 formal complaints. And how many resulted in termination or even formal disciplinary action?" A pause. "None," she said quietly. Jasmine nodded once. "Thank you." She turned back to the room. "Here's what we're going to do. Starting today, every employee will undergo mandatory equity and conduct training not just once, but quarterly. I don't care if you're a pilot, a lounge receptionist, or a C-suite executive. Murmurs began to rise, but Jasmine cut through them. We're also establishing a third-party compliance board. All discrimination complaints will bypass our internal HR channels. Independent review. Full transparency. The head of legal began to object. Wilson, that could expose us to enormous liability if made retroactive. Then maybe you shouldn't have built a company whose operations rely on hiding the problem instead of solving it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Finally, she said, we are restructuring the first-class cabin itself. Not just service procedures, but hiring, uniforms, training, even seating design. The idea that luxury equals exclusion ends today. A murmur of confusion. Jasmine walked to the whiteboard and drew a triangle. At the top, luxury. At the bottom, belonging. We've spent decades marketing the top of this pyramid to people who already expect to be treated well. We're flipping it. First class should feel luxurious not because of exclusivity, but because of dignity. Quiet respect. Effortless care. No one should be wondering if they belong when they've already bought the seat. The room was stunned. No one had ever heard a CEO talk like this before. Not in aviation, not in finance, not in boardrooms where policies had long been written to protect margins, not people. Any questions? A long pause. Then the PR director raised her hand. What do we tell the press? Jasmine answered instantly. Tell them the truth. She tapped her watch, then nodded to her aide. A door opened at the far end of the hallway. In stepped a team from a major civil rights firm, followed by executives from 2 global consulting agencies. They carried binders, audit templates, diversity compliance plans. Gentlemen, Jasmine said, meet the people who will be conducting your interviews. The executives exchanged glances, realizing this wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was the beginning of a cultural audit unlike anything the airline had ever undergone. Downstairs, the lobby TV played the morning news. Atlantic CEO launches sweeping airline reforms following in-flight incident, the anchor read. Sources say the changes may reshape the industry as we know it. Upstairs, Jasmine Wilson looked out at the boardroom one last time. I'm not here to clean up a PR crisis, she said. I'm here to rebuild the system that created it. As the internal audits began to ripple through Atlantic Airways, something unexpected happened. Emails started flooding into Jasmine Wilson's executive inbox. Not customer complaints this time, not press inquiries or media alerts. These came from inside the company. Cabin crew, ground staff, gate agents, even middle managers, all telling the same kinds of stories. Anonymous, cautious, but chillingly consistent. One message read, I've worked here 11 years. We were told to keep premium cabins premium. That meant not overserving certain people. We all knew what that really meant. Another, there's a manager in Dallas who screens upgrades. He keeps a list of non-standard profiles that should be double-checked before being allowed into first. I didn't realize until yesterday how wrong this was. The stories weren't about single bad apples. They revealed something systemic, an entire culture maintained through innuendo, coded language, and unspoken rules. And it wasn't just about race. There were stories about passengers with disabilities denied assistance. LGBTQ couples refused adjacent seats, even veterans in uniform questioned about their ticket class. Jasmine had known there was rot, but she hadn't expected the floodgate. Her chief of staff, Nora, began assembling what she labeled the tapes, a secure repository of whistleblower testimony. Within 48 hours, over 300 testimonies had been verified and cataloged. Some included audio recordings. One featured a flight attendant training session in Denver where a senior trainer explained how to discreetly preserve the premium atmosphere by avoiding passengers likely to draw complaints. The examples given, loud accents, obvious tattoos, certain hairstyles, and yes, certain profiles. You know what I mean? That audio clip alone would have torched the airline and the media. But Jasmine didn't leak it. She used it differently. She had the recording played in full without warning at the next leadership development seminar. 50 executives sat in a minimalist auditorium on the 10th floor, flanked by HR and legal observers. As the clip played, a silence fell over the room. No one moved. No one breathed. When it ended, Jasmine stood from the back row. Raise your hand, she said quietly, If that was the first time you've heard something like that in this company, not a single hand went up. That moment was more damning than any press release. These weren't isolated incidents. They were normalized behaviors. And worse, they were known. After the seminar, 3 VPs quietly resigned. Jasmine didn't comment publicly. She didn't need to. The system was beginning to dismantle itself. Later that week, she met privately with the head of Atlantic's cabin operations division, a man named Victor Dalton, known for his unshakable confidence and a decade of unchallenged authority over crew policy. Victor walked into Jasmine's office wearing his signature silver cufflinks and a neutral tie. He sat with the easy posture of someone used to controlling the room. "I know why I'm here," he said before she could speak. "I've seen the footage, the transcripts, the crew logs." And Jasmine asked, her tone unreadable. "And it looks bad, but it's not what it seems. These protocols, premium preservation profile alerts, none of it was meant to be discriminatory." Jasmine folded her hands. "Then what were they?" Victor hesitated. "They were operational tools," he said finally, "to protect the brand." Jasmine tilted her head. "Define the brand." He didn't answer. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts from the whistleblower archive. Photos, quotes, flagged emails, everyone tied to policies written by Victor's department. She didn't raise her voice. "You trained them to see worth through a lens of conformity. You made dignity conditional. And now you're trying to tell me it was about operational efficiency?" Victor's shoulders tightened. "I never told anyone to discriminate." "No," Jasmine replied. "You just gave them a system that did it for them." He looked down. Then to her surprise, he whispered, "I didn't think anyone would ever question it." Jasmine stood. "That's the problem." She extended a resignation form across the desk. Victor signed without protest. The dominoes were falling. Across Atlantic's internal network, Jasmine's reforms were now called the Equity Protocol. Each department had 30 days to submit a bias mitigation plan. Every manager had to complete a full-day intensive with third-party instructors. And a rotating compliance board formed from both internal staff and external auditors had final say over hiring, promotion, and passenger dispute outcomes. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She turned her attention to the pilots' union. The cockpit had been largely silent during the discrimination scandal, a wall of professional detachment. But Jasmine knew better. A handful of complaints, quiet, subtle, had revealed something she couldn't ignore. So she called a closed-door meeting with 10 of the most senior captains. What she showed them was simple: a map, a red dot heat map of all discrimination complaints filed over 5 years. Each dot correlated with a flight. But something curious emerged. The majority of incidents happened not in economy, where chaos often reigns, but in first and business class cabins on long-haul routes. The captains sat silently as the pattern revealed itself. "The problem isn't that people act out on planes," Jasmine said. "The problem is that certain people aren't allowed to exist in peace on planes." She paused, then added, "You've all walked down the cabin, you've seen it, and you've looked away." One of the captains, a man with 3 decades in the sky, finally spoke. "We were told not to get involved with cabin disputes unless safety was threatened." "Discrimination is a threat to safety," Jasmine said flatly. From that day forward, all captains were required to report service bias incidents directly to the office of the CEO, not to HR, not to PR, to her. No more excuses, no more bureaucracy. Outside the company, media outlets speculated about how long Jasmine could sustain the pressure. They called it Wilson's reckoning. Some CEOs privately mocked her behind closed doors, but the numbers didn't lie. Bookings rose, customer retention spiked, and internal employee applications from women, people of color, veterans, LGBTQ professionals doubled. Jasmine wasn't creating fear. She was restoring dignity. And the systems that had thrived in silence were finally cracking under the sound of truth. As the structural reforms intensified within Atlantic Airways, Jasmine Wilson knew that ground-level change training, flight attendants revising service protocols, issuing public apologies, was only half the battle. The rot went deeper. It was embedded in the executive tier. The decision-makers, the culture setters, the ones who had for years designed a system that prioritized appearance over equity and optics over accountability. So she launched the purge. Not overnight. That would have triggered legal firestorms and media backlash, but in waves. Precise, strategic, unflinching. It began with silence. An internal audit memo circulated discreetly to every division head. All leadership teams must submit 5-year internal performance evaluations and diversity compliance records within 72 hours. Omission will be interpreted as non-compliance. That single sentence sent panic through Atlantic's C-suite. In plush corner offices overlooking New York and LA, executives scrambled to compile sanitized records. But the real data already harvested by Jasmine's covert review team told a different story. Board member number 3, a longtime ally of the airline's founding family, had greenlit the promotion of 14 executives in 3 years, all white, all male. The VP of Customer Experience had quietly shut down 3 internal complaints, citing service-based racial profiling, marking them unsubstantiated without investigation. The Chief Marketing Officer had signed off on a global campaign featuring only Eurocentric imagery, despite internal objections from his own staff. Every one of them had their file. Every one of them had their moment. The first to fall was Nathan Bellamy, Executive Director of Customer Strategy. A self-proclaimed data-driven innovator, Nathan had built his brand around predictive service modeling and AI customer flow tracking. But Jasmine's team had discovered something damning. Nathan's algorithm flagged incongruent profile passengers, a euphemism for customers whose appearance didn't match expected behavior based on seat class. The algorithm had been praised in industry journals. Now it was an ethical grenade. Jasmine confronted Nathan in a closed-door session attended by legal and HR observers. "You built a system that taught our staff to question black and brown passengers before they ever stepped on board," she said. Nathan stammered. "The AI was neutral. It only used historical data." "Historical data," Jasmine replied, "that reflected decades of bias. You didn't build neutral systems. You automated discrimination." Nathan was escorted out of the building before sunset. His departure triggered a cascade. 3 other senior leaders resigned in the next 48 hours. Stock analysts began speculating was Atlantic Airways imploding, but the opposite was true. Morale surged. Internal forums flooded with anonymous messages. "For the first time, I feel like someone upstairs actually sees what we've dealt with. We used to joke that HR stood for hide reports. Not anymore. The purge isn't scary. It's overdue." Still, Jasmine understood that deeper resistance would come next. The institutionalists. The ones who didn't act overtly discriminatory but upheld the system through passivity, plausible deniability, and moral fog. She summoned them to a summit. 30 executives. 1 room, 1 mandate accountability. She didn't use slides, no charts, no branding. Just a whiteboard with a question written in thick black marker. "Who did you protect and why?" No one answered at first. Then a woman near the back, Director of Regional Ops, raised her hand. "We weren't trained to challenge bias. We were trained to avoid scandal, to minimize friction." Jasmine nodded. "And what did that training cost?" The room fell silent again. After an excruciating pause, someone else whispered, "It cost us the truth." Exactly. From that moment, Jasmine rewrote Atlantic's executive contracts. Every new hire, VP and above, would be held personally liable for the ethical performance of their teams. Bias-related customer incidents would directly impact bonuses and board eligibility. No more plausible deniability. But not everyone cooperated. Garrison Trent, a legacy board member and former CFO, fought back. He accused Jasmine of conducting a woke crusade, claiming her reforms undermined shareholder value. He leaked an internal memo to a financial blog attempting to frame her leadership as unstable, driven by emotion, not economics. Jasmine's response: she invited him to a public shareholder meeting. Let him speak first. He launched into a carefully worded tirade about strategic overreach, diversity over merit, and weaponized grievance culture. The room was tense. When he finished, Jasmine took the podium. She said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she clicked a remote. A screen lit up behind her with 3 numbers. 87%. Customer satisfaction among minority travelers up from 31%. And 42%. Overall increase in net promoter score. 300,000 projected quarterly revenue growth. "Those are the numbers," she said. "That's what equity builds." Then she turned to Garrison. "You called this a crusade," she said, "but what I'm doing isn't ideological. It's structural. And the structure you built prioritized comfort over fairness, optics over ethics, "It ends now," the room erupted in applause. Garrison Trent resigned the next day. The final test came from the board itself. Three longtime members, anonymous in public, powerful in private, tried to orchestrate a no-confidence vote citing Jasmine's disruptive governance. She met with each of them individually, but instead of arguing, she listened, took notes, then handed each of them a sealed envelope. Inside was a breakdown of their private conflicts of interest flagged by Omnicore's compliance team. One had used airline funds to sponsor a political gala. Another had overridden customer complaint audits to protect a favored regional director. The third had falsified first-class usage data to secure upgrades for family. They withdrew their challenge. Jasmine didn't fire them. She let them resign with full statements admitting personal failure to be published on Atlantic's investor page. The purge was complete. In just 6 weeks, 17 executives had stepped down. 2 board members removed. 7 new leaders installed, 5 of them. Women, 4 people of color, 3 with prior experience in civil rights or ethics compliance. Jasmine didn't hold a press conference. No victory lap. She simply changed the locks on the executive floor. And across Atlantic Airways, the message echoed loud and clear: this isn't a rebrand, it's a rebirth. As the dust settled in Atlantic Airways' upper ranks, Jasmine Wilson turned her focus to the people who mattered most: passengers. She understood what many CEOs forget. Cultural change isn't complete until the customers feel it, until they trust it. And in the weeks following the infamous flight, trust was in short supply. At first, the emails trickled in, quiet notes of support from longtime travelers who had seen and endured far too much. But as the story gained momentum, the trickle became a flood. Thousands of testimonials, messages, and recorded stories poured into the newly created Equity Response portal. Some were only a few sentences. "They made my daughter cry because she dared to ask for another blanket. My dad paid for business class for our family. They tried to split us up because he looked economy. They said I must have booked with points. I paid in full." Others were long-form letters, carefully crafted documents that chronicled years of targeted microaggressions, seating downgrades, meal shortages, and silent refusals of dignity. Jasmine read as many as she could, not as a CEO, as a Black woman who had lived these experiences herself. She felt every word, and she vowed to give those words weight. So she created the Passenger Equity Review Board, a panel composed of former passengers, civil rights experts, and frontline service workers with no corporate ties. Their sole job: review past incidents, reopen old complaints, and audit closed cases for bias patterns. It wasn't symbolic, it was structural accountability. Within 30 days, the board identified over 1,700 incidents across 5 years that had been mishandled or dismissed without investigation. Each case was assigned a point of contact manager, empowered to offer formal apologies, reimbursements, and where necessary, initiate employee review. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She wanted the voices of the silence to reshape policy. So she launched the Passenger Shadowing Program, a revolutionary initiative where corporate staff, including herself, would fly anonymously in various cabins, observing how policies translated into practice. No fanfare, no CEO onboard emails, just quiet passengers watching with sharp eyes and open notebooks. On one of these shadow flights, Jasmine boarded with a team member dressed in business casual and wearing no name tag. She took seat 17B in economy, middle row, no upgrades. No one recognized her. Not at first. 2 rows ahead, an elderly Latina woman requested assistance stowing her bag. The attendant sighed, gestured vaguely, and moved on. Jasmine rose from her seat and lifted the bag into the overhead bin. That night, she personally sent a memo: "We are not a luxury brand if we cannot extend basic respect." Meanwhile, on the ground, another movement was growing. The passengers themselves were fighting back. Inspired by Jasmine's leadership, they began documenting every flight. They shared photos, service experiences, timestamps. Hashtags trended. Hashtag fly with respect. Hash first class for all. One viral video showed a Black couple being moved from premium seats they had purchased until fellow passengers protested and forced the staff to back down. Another clip showed a young Black woman being ignored repeatedly by flight attendants until a white man swapped seats with her and immediately received water and service. These stories weren't just going viral, They were validating what many had long suspected: discrimination in the skies wasn't rare. It was routine, and now the world was watching. Rather than suppress it, Jasmine embraced it. She amplified it. She hired a digital engagement team to compile and analyze all passenger reports. The insights led to real-time adjustments, staffing changes, new bias response protocols, and even route-specific training based on recurring complaint geographies. Within 6 weeks, Atlantic Airways published the first real-time public bias dashboard of any airline in the world. It showed response times to bias complaints, resolution rates, regional breakdowns of service discrepancies, ongoing equity projects and their results. No fine print, no corporate doublespeak, just data, humanized, transparent. Media outlets called it radical. Investors worried it was too much. But customers, they came back. Atlantic's rebooking rates skyrocketed. New loyalty signups increased 61%, especially among Gen Z and millennial travelers who saw ethics as a feature, not a side note. Even longtime critics, frequent flyers who once scoffed at woke business practices, began changing their tone. On one radio segment, a retired Marine who had flown exclusively with another airline for 30 years said this: "I watched that woman sit there with her economy meal while the crew served caviar 5 feet away. That wasn't right. That could have been my daughter." I switched airlines that day. Back at headquarters, Jasmine knew the shift wasn't permanent, not yet. Culture is fragile. Reputations shatter faster than they're built. So she made it permanent. Atlantic's Passenger Equity Bill of Rights was ratified into company policy, distributed to all passengers digitally and printed on the back of every ticket. 1. Every passenger has the right to equal treatment regardless of appearance, attire, accent, or assumed status. 2. Every complaint of discrimination will be acknowledged, investigated, and resolved with transparency. 3. Service disparities must be documented by crew. Repeated incidents result in review. 4. Passengers may document their experience. Interference is prohibited. 5. All crew are required to complete quarterly equity recertification. Failure results in suspension. It wasn't PR. It was law within the skies. Soon other airlines followed. At first quietly, then loudly. Industry leaders began meeting with Jasmine. Universities requested her keynote lectures. Equity scholars cited her framework as a model for modern business justice. But she never forgot the root. A meal, a slap, a moment. One night she returned to the quiet of her apartment and pulled out her old flight log, where she documented every discriminatory moment from her years as a frequent flyer. She stared at one entry from 2011, denied meal. Told it was a glitch, everyone else eating steak. I got peanuts. She tore the page out. Then wrote underneath 2024, served a purpose. The transformation at Atlantic Airways had reached full operational velocity. Jasmine Wilson, in the months following the explosive incident on Flight 247, had personally overseen the rollout of the airline's largest systemic overhaul in decades. But real reform, she knew, was more than just a PR strategy or a list of corporate talking points. It required a shift in behavior at every level of the organization. As part of the 90-day reform plan she had initiated, Jasmine established a covert audit system called Project Mirror. Random flights were monitored by undercover evaluators representing diverse identities: race, gender, disability, age posing as passengers. Their task was simple: observe, record, report. Not to shame or punish, but to reveal truths that would otherwise remain unseen. The results shocked even the reform team. While some crews performed with remarkable equity and professionalism, others showed lingering patterns of subtle exclusion and coded disrespect. This data informed Jasmine's next phase, a complete restructuring of frontline operations. A new position was created: equity steward. Every flight now carried at least one equity steward trained not only in service excellence, but in identifying, de-escalating, and documenting bias in real time. Unlike traditional supervisors, they reported directly to the Office of Ethics and Inclusion, bypassing traditional managerial layers that had often suppressed complaints. Behind the scenes, the cultural ripple effect expanded. Former employees who had once resigned in quiet protest were being rehired under the new code of ethics. Whistleblowers previously ignored were now being honored and given roles in policy design. The airline's employee intranet featured an open forum where anonymous staff members could share experiences, suggest reforms, and vote on operational changes an innovation that other airlines soon copied. But not everyone embraced the change. Legacy executives clinging to old hierarchies quietly undermined reforms or delayed implementation with bureaucratic tactics. Jasmine was prepared. She brought in an independent audit firm that cross-referenced reform timelines with internal email communications and policy rollouts. Delays and sabotage were traced, documented, and met with swift executive exits. Within 6 months, 10 senior leaders had been replaced not for insubordination, but for clinging to irrelevance in a time of necessary evolution. Meanwhile, Jasmine had begun mentoring mid-level managers who had shown early alignment with the reform vision. These weren't high-profile stars. They were quiet change-makers who had long been overlooked. One such individual was Malik Reyes, a first-generation college graduate from El Paso, who had worked his way up from baggage handler to crew scheduler. Jasmine invited him to present to the board his ideas for inclusive scheduling algorithms, a proposal that was not only approved but later patented. Externally, Atlantic Airways' transformation had begun to influence competitors. Industry conferences that once avoided the term equity now featured entire panels discussing Jasmine's model. News networks profiled the airline's comeback story not as a fluke, but as a case study in ethical leadership meeting corporate performance. Bookings increased by 37% in 6 months. Employee turnover fell by half. Jasmine watched it all unfold from her office overlooking Manhattan. Yet for all the momentum, she remained unsatisfied, because she knew what many didn't, that the next test would be harder than the first. Sustaining cultural integrity after the initial wave of reform was not about systems. It was about character. As she stared out at the skyline, her phone buzzed. A message from her Chief of Strategic Affairs' incoming whistleblower report. Crew on Flight 338 may be violating new service protocols. Do you want to review personally? She replied with one word. Absolutely. Because for Jasmine Wilson, reform was not a chapter. It was the whole book. Jasmine Wilson stood alone in the executive conference suite on the 73rd floor of Atlantic Airways' headquarters. The glass walls framed a sweeping view of the Manhattan skyline, but Jasmine's gaze was fixed on the translucent screen before her, one that displayed live anonymized feedback from passengers currently flying across the Atlantic Pacific and domestic U.S. routes. It wasn't the data she was focused on, though. It was the invisible shift behind the numbers. Customer satisfaction had increased, yes. Complaints had plummeted. But more importantly, the comments no longer reflected despair hidden behind courtesy. Instead, Jasmine saw gratitude, fairness, dignity. People were being seen. And for Jasmine, this was the true scoreboard. She turned as Greg Fallon entered the room carrying a secured case. He placed it on the table and opened it to reveal 2 items, a draft of the Federal Aviation Reform Proposal and a USB key containing footage compiled from Flight 247 passenger testimony and training violations from the past decade. This is everything Greg said. It's not just reform for Atlantic. It's leverage to push the FAA to adopt these changes nationwide. Jasmine nodded, taking the key in her hand, weighing it not for its physical presence, but for what it represented. We don't use this to punish, she said quietly. We use it to build. This becomes the foundation. Greg didn't argue. He knew by now that Jasmine's power wasn't derived from retaliation. It came from clarity of purpose. Her vision was never about toppling bad actors. It was about reconstructing broken systems so they couldn't harm again. Downstairs in the media briefing center, murmurs rose among reporters, stakeholders, and civil rights observers. News had leaked that Jasmine would be making an announcement, one that extended beyond Atlantic Airways. Jasmine descended the elevator in silence, each floor a memory. Gate agent Ashley at Jackson Airport, Brittany with the leftover pasta, the lead attendant who had fabricated lies to protect her team. Each had become a symbol, not of individual failure, but of cultural rot that had metastasized in silence for too long. She entered the briefing center to a standing room-only crowd. Her approach was quiet, unannounced, but when she stepped behind the podium, a hush fell. I'm not here to talk about an airline, she began, her voice steady. I'm here to talk about an industry, about how routine prejudice gets masked as policy, about how systems are built to protect behavior instead of people. Behind her, the screen displayed a timeline of incidents across multiple airlines, verifiable, documented, and damning. In row after row, passengers denied basic respect. Men and women of color accused of fraud at check-in. LGBTQ couples seated apart without explanation. Disabled veterans asked to prove their needs. Each one captured, time-stamped, ignored. I didn't acquire Atlantic Airways to punish a few people, she continued. I acquired it to rebuild from the inside out. But what we uncovered wasn't just internal. It's systemic, and now we act. She motioned to Greg, who stepped forward and slid the USB into the media station. What followed was a visual assault on industry complacency. It wasn't just Jasmine's flight, it was dozens, hundreds, cross-referenced with employee reports, hidden memos, and settlement agreements the public never saw. The crowd didn't gasp, they didn't cheer, they listened. And when the footage ended, Jasmine spoke one last sentence: "You can't fix what you refuse to acknowledge." After the briefing, Jasmine returned to her office and stood at the window once more. Behind her, the press began to circulate the story: Federal Aviation Equity Act proposal to enter Senate review. Civil rights groups endorsed the legislation. Competing airlines issued hasty PR statements, pledging to re-examine protocols. But none of that moved Jasmine. What did move her was a simple letter waiting on her desk. It was handwritten, mailed to headquarters without fanfare. It read, "I was on flight 247. I didn't say anything. I was afraid. But what you did gave me courage. I've started speaking up at work. It's not much, but it's a start. Thank you. A." She folded the letter and placed it beside her notebook. Change didn't begin in boardrooms or newsrooms. It began with someone deciding enough was enough. And Jasmine Wilson had decided that long ago. 6 months after the incident aboard Flight 247, Jasmine Wilson stood before the United Nations Committee on Global Transportation Standards. What had begun as a personal confrontation in the sky had evolved into a sweeping international movement, one that transcended borders, corporate hierarchies, and even the airline industry itself. She was not there to represent a single airline or even a single industry. She was there to represent an idea that dignity is not a luxury, that service is not a favor, that equity must be embedded into the operational DNA of any organization that dares to touch the public. Transportation connects humanity. Jasmine began standing behind a translucent lectern bearing the UN emblem. But when access is filtered through unconscious bias, when service is meted out by prejudice, we sever the very connections we claim to build. Behind her, a 3-tier digital display projected international case studies incidents across rail, maritime, and aviation, each marked by one common thread: inequality hidden beneath policy. Delegates from over 40 countries leaned forward taking notes, some uncomfortable, some angry, all paying attention. Jasmine continued, "I did not come here to embarrass institutions. I came to challenge their survival instincts. Because those that refuse to evolve will collapse quietly at first, then all at once." Her address was met with thunderous applause and became the cornerstone of a multinational agreement to establish the Global Passenger Equity Index, an international compliance and auditing framework to track treatment disparities in transportation systems. It would be mandatory for all carriers seeking code-share agreements with major global airlines. Atlantic Airways, under Jasmine's leadership, had volunteered to be the first case study. But Jasmine's mission didn't end in conference halls. Back in the United States, she led the establishment of the Wilson Center for Equity in Motion, a nonprofit think tank and advocacy body staffed with civil rights attorneys, policy analysts, and former service workers. The Wilson Center audited not just complaints, but intent, not just outcomes, but culture. They began issuing silent rankings for airlines, hospitality chains, even rideshare apps. Their influence grew so powerful that companies began adjusting internal policy before Wilson Center reviews were even announced. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Airways transformation was complete. No longer an industry cautionary tale, it had become the gold standard. The airline was now the first major U.S. carrier to reach a 99% inclusion rating in its first-class cabin experience, a metric independently verified by external auditors and passenger surveys. Crew training had evolved beyond compliance modules. Every attendant now underwent immersive simulations led by psychologists and former passengers. Evaluation was ongoing, 360-degree, and anonymous. Promotions were no longer based on tenure, but equity leadership scores. And perhaps most tellingly, the employee who replaced Brittany as head of international first-class service, was Sean, the young flight attendant, who had hesitated but ultimately spoke up. Jasmine had noticed him, not because he was perfect, but because he had the capacity to evolve, to stand in the gap between complicity and courage. On the one-year anniversary of Flight 247, Jasmine chose to fly anonymously from New York to Lagos, a route notorious for the kind of coded bias she had fought to dismantle. She boarded without fanfare. No camera crew, no security entourage. Just a woman in a charcoal suit reading a novel and sipping sparkling water. But something unexpected happened mid-flight. A young Nigerian girl seated in economy quietly approached Jasmine's seat. Nervous, she held out a folded napkin with handwriting in blue ink. "I want to be like you," it read. "How do I begin?" Jasmine paused. She pulled a pen from her bag and scribbled a note of her own. She folded it carefully and handed it back. Later, as the girl returned to her seat and opened the note, it read, "You begin by refusing to shrink when the world misjudges your size. Stay upright, stay kind, and always document everything." Back in her seat, Jasmine closed her eyes, letting the quiet hum of the engines surround her. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't watching for failure. She was witnessing change. Not the kind that came from punishment, but from principle. Not the kind that punished bad service, but that rebuilt systems. And not the kind that needed to be loud, but the kind that would last. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.